Good morning, everybody. Come join me for another walk. So today I'm going to talk about why the EU does need an EU military. And for the past couple of years now, President Macron of France has been advocating for this. And now it might actually possibly come true. President Erdogan over in Turkey is pushing for it. Turkey has the biggest military in Europe, and they're already a NATO member. And now Friedrich Merz of the CDU in Germany is saying that he's actually for it. So this might just happen. So kind of excited to talk about this. And so yeah, let's get into why the EU should have a military, but the propaganda campaign to fight against it. I hope you guys don't mind me going for a walk while I do this, by the way. But the European Union is an economic and political powerhouse. But when it comes to defense, it's fragmented, especially right now. The EU relies on NATO, with the United States carrying much of the burden. But is it time for the EU to take control of its own security with a united military force? I say yes. I think so, at least. Now, this idea is highly controversial, and that's not by accident, right? Powerful interests use propaganda and misinformation to keep the EU military weak, or the thought of it. And in today's video, we'll explain why an EU military makes sense and expose the tactics used to turn public opinion against it. Now, let's get started. Why does the EU need its own military? Well, the European Union is home to some of the world's largest economies, cutting-edge technology, and advanced defense industries. But despite this, EU countries rely heavily on NATO, meaning that when the crisis hits, Europe often depends on US leadership. Now, here is why a unified EU military is a logical next step. 1. Strategic autonomy. The EU needs to be able to defend itself without waiting for Washington's approval. The US has its own interests, and they don't always align with Europe, right? And if you don't have your head in the sand, you know this. And that's fine, it's okay. Every country has its own interests. But costs, and right now 27 different military budgets and procurement systems and command structures create inefficiency. A unified force could have reduced waste and improved coordination, right? So that's the second one, cost. And number 3, faster decision making. When conflicts arise, European countries often struggle to respond quickly because of their divided militaries. A single force, on the other hand, would streamline decision-making process. The question would be, who's going to run that force and how? That would be the question there. And number 4, global influence. A strong EU military would give Europe more diplomatic leverage in global affairs, ensuring that it isn't just a follower in world's politics. So that leads me to who opposes this and why? Well, despite these clear advantages, the idea of an EU military faces strong opposition. Let's look at the key players who benefit from keeping a Europe military divided. Us, the United States, we'll start with us. Washington wants Europe dependent on NATO, where the US has the final say in major decisions. Strong independent, but to counteract that, a strong independent EU military would have reduced this influence. The other actor, good old Russia. A united European defense force would be a direct challenge to Russian military ambitions. Moscow benefits from a divided Europe, which is easier to intimidate. But if Europe had an EU force, they would outnumber the Russian force by 500,000 soldiers. And then you have politicians, right? European leaders argue that countries should maintain their full military independence. However, in practice, this often means relying on the US for protection. So you see where the issue is there? And then you have defense contractors, right? Separate military budgets mean more contracts, more inefficiencies and more profits for arms manufacturers. So why would they want unification? Which leads me to how propaganda and misinformation undermine the EU military. To keep the EU from developing its own military, propaganda and misinformation are widely used. And here's how. You get the fear mongering, right? About EU control. Opponents claim that an EU military would mean Brussels is taking over national armies. In reality, EU force would be controlled by elected governments, just like NATO is today. Number two, NATO dependence myth, right? Some argue that NATO is enough and that the EU military would be redundant. But history shows the US can act unpredictably. Now, what happens if Washington decides to shift away from Europe? Think about that. And number three, exaggerating costs. Critics often inflate that the price tag of an EU military. However, military cooperation would likely save money by eliminating waste and duplication. Which leads me to number four, spreading division among EU nations. Fake news and political narratives promote disunity, making it seem like EU countries would never agree on military cooperation. In reality, joint defense projects are already happening. I mean, there's already NATO. It's pretty much NATO without the US. And number five, portraying the threat that NATO claims an EU army would weaken it. In truth, a stronger Europe would make NATO more balanced and less dependent on the US. So, let's move into the next section of the future of EU defense. So what's next? The EU has already taken steps towards military cooperation with projects like PESCO, the Permanent Structured Cooperation, and the European Defense Fund. However, a full EU military will require overcoming decades of propaganda and political resistance. The question is, will Europe step up, or will it remain dependent on external powers? I'm not sure. But if you found this video insightful, don't forget to like, subscribe, leave a comment. Do you think the EU should create its own military? I mean, I think it should, but discuss below. And thanks for watching. Also share this with your friends. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.